what would happen if you skipped social media for 30 days? A lot of people think that social media is mostly about wasting time, but while it does use up a lot of time, there's a whole lot more to it that we're going to talk about. In North America, they use a little bit more than 2 hours a day on social media. South America is almost 3.5 hours. Africa is over 3 hours. Europe's an hour 15, and Asia is a little over 2 hours. On average, in the world, we spend 2 hours, 25 minutes per day on social media, which is about 1 hour more than 8 years ago. In recent years, they've found that the more social media people use, the more they have problems with stress, they have anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, they have loss of self-esteem, because a lot of social media is all about validating yourself through comparison and posting the right pictures and getting thumbs up and likes. And even though people are going on to feel valued and pursue friends, they end up actually feeling more lonely and more isolated. And maybe the biggest problem that we're going to talk about is a loss of focus. The driving force on social media is the magic of maybe. So it's kind of like a slot machine, which is one of those gambling devices called one-armed bandit. And it is the probability of a win, that you don't get it every time, and it's not a regular interval. It's intermittent and sort of unexpected. And then when you get it, when you look, that maybe there is a new text, maybe there is a new like, maybe there is a new heart, maybe there's something interesting or fun, then once we hit that positive note, there's a 400% rise in dopamine, which is our pleasure, our habit-forming pleasure neurotransmitter. And that 400% rise isn't quite the same as cocaine, but it's pretty close. But whatever we might think about the internet and phones and social media, they started out with good intentions. It was about communication, information, and making it all more convenient. But then as it grew, they figured out that there was money to be made. And now they started competing for your time. They started developing algorithms to make you spend more time on their platform, because if they could get you to spend more time, they could sell more ads and they could increase their profits. And now these companies developed and hired attention engineers. And these were people who specialized in developing maximum addiction on purpose. So they studied addiction, they studied neurology, they studied endocrinology, they studied the gambling behaviors, and they try to incorporate as many of those factors, of those addictive factors as possible on purpose to get people to spend more time and actually get addicted to these social platforms. So what we have to understand, though, is that there's still something good underneath all this. It's not all bad, but you can use the internet and use these social media as a tool, or if you don't pay attention, if you're not careful, then you become the tool. A big foundation in my channel is talking about how the world is changing faster than our physiology. So we have to start understanding how that world is affecting our physiology and our bodies. The world has changed more in the last 50 years than it has in the previous 50,000. We have foods we never ate before. We have processed foods, we have sugar, we have depleted food, we have GMOs, we have pollution and pesticides that the body never encountered before. We have a level of stress and a pace and a hectic life we never had before. And technology is kind of a double-edged sword. It helps us in many ways become more productive and become very convenient, but at the same time, it sort of adds to the burden as well, because there's more to keep up of and we have to adapt to this high pace. And what we have to keep in mind with these fast changes is your DNA can't keep up. Your DNA, your genome, your genetic material changes at the rate of tens of thousands of years to make significant changes. So what's happened in the last 50 years, your body has no chance to keep up with that. The other thing we have to keep in mind that whatever your experience is, whatever food produces, hormones, whatever pollution does to you, whatever stress and technology does to you, it is your brain that processes all of it. So there's a big discussion going on about social media and how people are feeling different. And they're kind of looking just at human behavior in the short term. But the bigger question that we have to ask is if we understand that the brain processes all of this and social media changes our health and our behavior, then how is social media creating those brain changes? When they talk about addiction, they usually make a differentiation between behavioral addictions and substance addictions. So everything on the table here would be substance addictions like alcohol and cigarettes and morphine and so forth. But behavioral, that's more like sexual addiction and gambling and now social media. It's a behavioral change. However, what we have to realize is that in the brain, the changes are very similar. The behavior or the substance, they act very much the same way in the long run. And what they have found is that it produces a degeneration in certain areas in the brain. And those are the ones responsible for attention and focus. When you have your attention, you have your focus on certain things, it's because you have the ability to filter other things. And we'll come back and talk about that. And these centers, these brain areas, also are controlling emotion and decision making. So we'll come back to this, and a lot of this is about the frontal lobe, the executive center of the brain. And why is it so critical? Why do we want to go that extra step and talk about mechanisms? Because this addictive behavior, these are things that we know we should change. Another thing that people try to change is their weight and their eating behavior. Everyone says that I should eat less. Well, how is that working? Because if all you try to do is eat less, you will ultimately fail. And that's what we're seeing over and over. Because first we have to understand that different foods produce different hormonal responses, and these hormones determine behavior, and over time, this behavior and this food will create disease. But if we don't understand the mechanism and we know the consequence, then we're not going to get motivated enough to make changes. But once we understand, now we can change the foods, make other hormones, and now we have some power. The exact same thing is going on with social media. It's just that we're consuming video, we're consuming bits of data instead of food. So if you're addicted, but you say, oh, I'm going to try to spend less time, that is probably not going to be very effective. Because social media are creating these brain changes that lead to addiction, that lead to these mental and physical health problems. But because of these brain changes, just like with the hormones, you are not in complete control. You have to step back and get some motivation and some distance to this so you understand the consequences and the mechanism, and then you have a chance to do something about it. Now, to really understand how these social media devices, how these electronic devices affect the brain, we have to understand a little bit more about the brain and the purpose of the brain, how the brain works, how the brain gets programmed. So the purpose of the brain is to interact with our environment. And to do that, we have to be adaptable and we have to be flexible. Humans can exist in the largest number of environments of any species. We are so incredibly adaptive because we have the most flexible, the most complex brain of any living thing. And most of that interaction with our environment also relates to movement. And with movement, of course, we can move about in our environment and create habitats and find food. Now, awareness is the ability to perceive things, to interpret, to respond to your environment and interact with it, to be aware of it first. And this is a unicellular, this is a single cell. And it does have some awareness. It does have some ability to interpret and process and interact with its environment. But it's very, very limited because its sensory apparatus is very primitive and it has a very small surface area. Now, if we just multiply that a few times, we get a multicellular life form. It's still very primitive. But assuming that these cells can communicate, that they have the ability to interact with each other and also to cooperate, to move toward a common goal, toward a higher purpose. Now, this life form with 4 cells can start to express a more complex, a slightly more complex behavior than the single cell. And in doing that, it has expanded its awareness. It can do more stuff. And that, of course, leads us to the human brain, which is arguably the most complex structure in the known universe. And the brain is housed inside the skull, and the extension of the brain is the spinal cord, and together they form the central nervous system. And that contains about 100 billion neurons. In your body, total, you have about 40 trillion cells, and they all communicate indirectly, but the brain and central nervous system is what ties together all that communication. Without that communication, you would just be a bunch of cells, but with that coordinating action, you are a community that can work toward a common goal. And each of these 100 billion neurons, they just don't link together in a loop. They make an incredibly complex network. They each make about 5,000 to 10,000 connections or synapses on average. And there's some cells in the small brain, in the cerebellum, that make about 200,000 connections per cell. And all of these connections add up to your neural networks. Now, if we can increase and maintain that complexity, all those connections, if we can maintain that interconnectedness, that strong connection, then we're also going to increase the metabolic threshold, the ability of these cells to perform work. And that's going to create stability and robustness. And what does that do? It is the very properties, the strength that lets you be resilient and withstand stress and anxiety and trauma and so forth. So then, of course, the question is, how do we improve and maintain all of these 5 factors to build ourselves a strong brain? And the answer is we want to create multiple inputs for the brain. So if you're out like this guy hiking, then there is a principle called Hebb's law that says that cells that fire together wire together. So this guy is involved in something called spatial summation. And what that means is he's getting input from many, many different directions. And that provides some context for what he's doing. He has gravity, he has muscle tone, he has movement, he has temperature, he has hearing, and all of these different inputs provide a context that gets wired together in a very complex network. So we have the visual input, the movement, gravity, stretch, sound, it all gets wired in. And now we get this very complex wiring that gets strengthened the more we use it into this robust and resilient brain. And the more of these cells and the more of these connections we also have an increased and expanded awareness, an increased ability to take in the environment and process that information. And the opposite of that would be spatial subtraction. Now, that's not a real thing. Spatial summation is a real neurological term, but I made this one up to illustrate the difference between that complex hiking behavior and what happens when you're sitting down with an electronic device. So things like games and cell phones and social media and basically all electronic devices with a very narrow focus does this. So what happens now is you have a very fast changing, very interesting, very intense visual input. So you're activating certain areas in your brain related to visual input, but there's no change in the environment. The environment doesn't match what's going on with the visual input, so you don't get that complex wiring. Instead, you get a very incomplete wiring of the brain. And as a result, the more limited your wiring, the more you focus on one aspect without getting that matching input, the more you get a shrinking perception and consciousness. You are less able to experience life because you're conditioning and programming your brain to function primarily on electronic devices. So I grew up with Mario Brothers and Nintendo, and I quickly became pretty addicted. I loved those games. But I stopped because after I had sat down for a few hours and I got that tunnel vision and I stood up and I was all dazed and confused, I got scared. I realized that this is very, very dangerous to the brain. This was long before I had any training in this specific brain stuff, but I understood that this can't be good. And if something is that addictive and it makes me feel that way, and I have the tendency to become that addicted, then I just can't do that at all. But now you might ask, what about 20 minutes? Would that be okay? If you do this 20 minutes once in a while. And here's the thing to understand, that it's all about balance. That which do you do more of? If you move more in a three-dimensional world and getting that complex input, and you're getting 5 or 10 times more of that than you do the limited electronic device input, then the complex input is going to override the narrow input. But the way we're doing it today with most people and the addictive nature, we are getting way, way more electronic time than we are time out in the real world. Now we have an absolute epidemic of poor attention span. And when we have poor attention span, short attention span, then the people are trying to get our attention have to go to new lengths. So they know how to increase the stimuli. That's why movies and TV and advertising look so different than it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now you have to create sounds, you have to change the angles, you have to zoom in and out, you have to edit things with 2-second clips. You have to keep things moving because if something stays the same for 5 seconds, people have lost their attention already. But then when they keep stimulating you more, when they're using all their tricks, then your attention span gets even worse because they can't get your attention. It's like you get worse and worse and worse. They have to get more and more inventive. They have to come up with stronger stimuli. So this becomes a vicious cycle that the better they become at getting your attention, the worse your attention gets. And then eventually you can't create attention on your own if your life depended on it. And I think this is a bigger problem than most people realize, that we no longer have the ability to sit still. We get restless, we get nervous, we get bored. We feel really bad if we just have to sit for even a minute. If there's peace and quiet, if there's none of these stimuli interrupting us, we get anxious. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to create focus. And we lose that ability to focus, and we even lose the ability to think. Whenever we're left to our own thoughts, we look for something to interrupt it. We don't know how to maintain a stream of thought, of constructive thought, and evolve that thought. We're just looking for something to stimulate us to interrupt that quiet moment. And one way this shows up in my world, of course, is there's so many people who want short videos. They want quick sound bites. They just want the bullet list. Tell me what it is. I don't want to understand it. Just tell me what to do. But that doesn't leave them any wiser. That doesn't leave them any better off, because they get the list and then they compare it to another list that says something else, and now they're more confused than ever. Another thing that they do is, of course, they watch it on higher speed. They speed it up to 1.5 times or 2 times the speed, because they feel that if they can just listen and catch the words, then they've watched the video. Here's the problem though, it doesn't make an impact on your brain. It doesn't create a complex network. It doesn't integrate in your nervous system unless you can process and think about the information. And you can do that while you're watching, but of course you can't do that if you speed it up to 2x. But if it is a good pace and you can keep up and sort of process that information while you're watching, then it has a lasting impact because you have integrated it into your nervous system. It's the same way, that's the difference between watching a quick video or reading a book. Reading a book forces you to use your brain in a different way, to engage more areas of your brain. You have to follow the lines in a very precise manner. You have to visualize, you have to create images in your brain. It's much, much more activating to read a book than just watch a movie or something like that. When they were talking about brain areas that degenerated and resulted in less focus, less ability to regulate emotions and make good decisions, they were talking about the frontal lobe, because the frontal lobe is also known as the executive center. It's the center for executive function. Everything that makes us human and the way humans are different from other species is about frontal lobe. And this helps us set better goals, make better decisions. It helps us plan and sustain focus. And how does it do that? It does it by turning off things that are not important. 90% of what the frontal lobe does is to turn things off. It turns off distraction. It turns off stress. It turns off anxiety. And that's why people with a strong brain, with a high metabolic threshold, with endurance, that's why they tolerate distractions and stress and anxiety much better. It rarely affects them. And social media does the exact opposite of everything we talked about. Social media fragments attention. It's designed to keep you unfocused so that you'll click on the next thing they flash on your screen. And if you do that long enough, it has the ability to permanently damage the ability to focus. So if you got to age 25 before you ever saw a cell phone, you're much better off because your brain was hopefully built to a certain strength at that point. But what if you get cell phones at this age, as a 2, 3, 4-year-old? Then you may never even develop that healthy brain with the good integration and the complex networks. Alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, addictive substances, they are restricted because we understand the consequences. But social media may be just as destructive in a slightly different way, especially if we keep it up. Because people understand to stay away from alcohol, tobacco, and addictive substances, so they might use them once in a while or not at all. But we don't understand that about social media and electronic devices yet. So we use electronic devices as pacifiers, as babysitters. We use them as digital companions instead of friends. For the first time in history, we have artificial digital companions. And of course, if the average is 2.5 hours per day, there are some that hardly use it at all and others that spend most of their day on these devices. And again, most of the discussion is about how is this affecting the quality of life short term? How is it affecting how people feel? But I really want to emphasize, we want to take it to the next level, and we want to ask, what is this doing if we have an incomplete brain? If we're either breaking down the brain or if we're not building it properly in the first place, what is that going to do 30, 40 years down the road? And I really, really hope I'm wrong, but I think what we're seeing isn't even the tip of the iceberg. Now, if you quit social media and electronic devices for 30 days, what will happen? You'll probably see improved mood, improved attention. You might even see improved thinking skills. If you spend some time with yourself and you force your brain to do things that it hasn't done in a while, like thinking, you'll probably see some improved productivity as a result of improved focus and attention and better thinking skills. And you might even see some improved self-esteem, depending on how you've been using the social media in the past. And you might appreciate your life more, your quality of life, when you find you have extra time for things that really matter. There's been a lot of research and there's been books written on this topic, and as a result, thousands of people have taken the challenge of putting away their phones and their social media, and they've noticed a dramatic improvement in the quality of life. About half of them have noticed dramatic improvement. So does that mean I think you should quit social media, that they're a bad thing, that cell phones are bad? No, I don't think that at all. I think it's a fantastic tool. But you have to understand, you have to learn to use it as a tool, or you become the tool. You become someone else's tool. So if you decide to quit for a period, that's fine. But if you don't, I want you to be aware and mindful. Really be honest and examine, step back, and before you pick it up, don't just mindlessly start clicking things. Examine, what's your purpose? Why am I doing this? Is this really adding value to me in any way? And I have a bunch of different social media accounts. I've never used them. I use YouTube to get information and to provide information. I have the other accounts. I've hardly ever been on them. But it's great to get information on YouTube. And if you use it for that, then it builds you up. It's very productive. It can also be for professional contacts. There's some platforms that can help you further your career if you use it for that and nothing else. I also use it for business texting. It's very efficient. If I'm not in the office and they have questions, we can quickly exchange information. I love to travel with my cell phone. It gets me directions. It tells me where the traffic jams are. It saves me time. If I'm traveling, I have flight reservations, hotel reservations, car rental reservations. It's all in one place. It's very convenient, right? And you can also use it for many, many different things. Like every time I go to the bathroom, I have 5 minutes, I do a language lesson. So right now I'm learning Spanish, German, and French. And there's lots and lots of things that your phone can do as long as you don't let yourself mindlessly fall into that endless pit of social media. If you enjoyed this video, you'll love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.